The wind howled through the trees as 12-year-old Eli clutched his dog's worn collar. The cabin before them stood like a miracle in the gathering darkness, its weathered planks promising shelter from the approaching storm. Exhaustion weighed heavy on his small shoulders after 3 days of wandering the mountain wilderness. Inside, dust danced in the fading light, filtering through grimy windows. A rough-hewn table lay overturned. Deep gouges scarred the wooden walls. Eli's fingers traced one mark, 4 parallel lines too large for any household pet. His dog Rusty whimpered, nose twitching at something unseen. The boy's stomach tightened as he noticed thick, dark hair caught in the doorframe. What creature had made this place its home, and how long before it returned to find strangers in its den? The silver compass felt heavy in Eli's palm as he rotated it gently, watching the needle quiver before settling on north. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "As long as you have this, son, you'll never truly be lost." Now, huddled in the strange cabin with Rusty pressed warm against his side, those words felt like a cruel joke. Pinewood Village had been the only home Eli had ever known. Nestled in a valley between towering peaks, it was a place where everybody knew your name and your business. 23 families, all told, living in harmony with the mountain's harsh rhythms. His father, Daniel, had been the village's unofficial guide, leading supply trips down to the town in the lowlands twice each season. His mother, Sarah, tended the village communal greenhouse, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn alpine soil. Rusty whimpered softly, pressing his nose to Eli's hand. The shepherd mix had been his companion since he was 7, when they'd found the abandoned pup half frozen in an early autumn snowstorm. "He's got mountain in his blood," his father had said. "Just like you." Eli stroked the dog's shaggy head, remembering summer days spent exploring the meadows and streams near the village. He'd learned to fish in those streams, to identify which berries were safe and which would leave you clutching your stomach. His father's lessons had been practical, unsentimental. "The mountain doesn't care if you're tired or scared or lost," he'd say, "so you'd best know how to take care of yourself." Winter evenings had been spent around the wood stove in their snug cabin, his mother teaching him to knit while his father carved intricate animals from pine. The villagers would gather in the community hall for music nights, old Mrs. Hanson playing fiddle while Mr. Erickson accompanied on his handmade accordion. But there had been signs of trouble, even before disaster struck. Last autumn, when the first snows fell earlier than anyone could remember, the worried discussions between his parents when they thought he was asleep. The village elders, meeting more frequently, faces grave as they pored over weather charts and historical records. "Climate's changing," he'd overheard his father telling his mother. "The mountain isn't as predictable as it used to be." Eli had been helping Mr. Jensen check the avalanche barriers when they'd spotted the first cracks in the snowpack high above the village. They'd hurried back to sound the warning, but even then, his father had seemed to know it wouldn't be enough. That night, his father had pressed the compass into his hand. "Keep this with you, always," he'd said, his eyes holding a strange intensity. "And remember everything I taught you about surviving out there." Eli hadn't understood then. Why would he need to survive out there when they had their snug cabin, their community? Now, as he clutched the compass in the darkness, he understood all too well. A sudden noise outside the cabin jerked him back to the present. Rusty's ears pricked forward, a low growl building in his throat. Eli held his breath, listening. Just the wind, he told himself. Just the wind through the trees. But as Rusty's growl deepened, Eli wasn't so sure. He tucked the compass back into his pocket, its weight a small comfort against the growing dread. The village was gone now. His parents were gone. All he had left was Rusty, this compass, and the survival skills his father had drilled into him since he was old enough to walk. "We're going to be okay," he whispered to Rusty, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "We just need to make it through the night, and then we'll figure out what to do." But as another sound came from outside, something heavy moving through the underbrush, Eli wondered if they would make it through the night at all. He gripped the compass tighter in his pocket, willing its needle to point him toward safety, toward home. But there was no direction that could lead him back to what he'd lost. Only forward, into the unknown, with danger closing in on all sides. Eli pulled the crumpled photograph from his pocket, smoothing its bent edges against his knee. 3 smiling faces stared back at him. His mother's eyes crinkled at the corners, his father's arm thrown protectively around them both, and his own gap-toothed grin from last summer. Before the mountain betrayed them. The first rumble had come just after dawn. Eli had been stoking the morning fire when the cups rattled on the shelves. His father had been outside checking the snow depth, a morning ritual through the winter months. His mother had paused in kneading bread dough, flour dusting her forearms, a question in her eye. Then came the sound, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them at once. Avalanche. The shout had rung through the village, amplified by panic. His father had burst through the door, face white beneath his beard. "The north slope's coming down," he'd gasped. "We need to get to the community shelter, now." They'd barely made it out the door when the wall of white hit the first row of cabins. The village had been built with avalanches in mind, with reinforced roofs and strategic placement, but nothing could have prepared them for this. The barrier walls that had protected them for generations crumbled like paper. The 3 of them ran, Rusty bounding ahead, as all around them neighbors did the same, some still in nightclothes, children clutched in arms. Erickson stumbled in the deep snow, her husband pulling her up without breaking stride. The Hansons' youngest was crying, the sound nearly lost in the mountain's roar. The ground shook beneath their feet. Eli's mother stumbled, his father catching her. "Almost there," he encouraged, though the shelter still seemed impossibly far. Eli would never forget what happened next. The way his father looked back, eyes widening at something behind them. The way he shoved Eli forward, with a strength born of desperation. "Run!" The crack in his voice as he turned back for Eli's mother, who had fallen again. The sound of splintering wood as the second wave of snow hit, bringing with it the remains of the north cabins, Rusty's teeth closing gently but firmly on his sleeve, dragging him toward the shelter when his legs refused to move. Inside the concrete bunker, he'd waited with the other survivors, 12 people and 3 dogs, all that remained of Pinwood Village. For 3 days they'd huddled there, rationing emergency supplies, listening to the mountain continue to grumble and shift above them. When they finally emerged, their world had vanished beneath 20 feet of snow and debris. Only the peaks of a few roofs remained visible. The search began immediately, but hope faded with each passing hour. On the 4th day, they recovered his father's body. His hand was still locked around his mother's wrist, as if he'd tried to pull her to safety until the very end. That night, as the survivors discussed evacuation plans, Eli had slipped away. He couldn't face the pitying looks, the well-meaning offers from neighbors to take him in. His uncle lived in a village 2 valleys over, but the route there would be impassable until spring. The community was planning to descend to the lowland town together, but Eli couldn't bear the thought of leaving the mountains, the only home he'd ever known, where his parents now lay buried in the snow. So as the others slept, exhausted from grief and labor, he'd packed his father's old rucksack, dried meat, matches, extra socks, the photograph, and the compass, the essentials his father had taught him to prioritize. With Rusty at his side, he'd set out into the wilderness as the first pink light of dawn touched the peaks. Now, 3 days later, staring at the photograph in the gloom of the cabin, Eli wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The wilderness his father had taught him to respect now seemed actively hostile. He tucked the photo away as Rusty raised his head, ears alert to some sound outside. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. The crude map Eli had sketched on a scrap of butcher paper trembled in his hands as a gust of wind threatened to tear it away. He tucked it quickly into his jacket pocket, squinting at the unfamiliar ridgeline ahead. Nothing matched his memory of his father's descriptions. 3 days of wandering had taken him deep into territory he'd never explored before. "What do you think, boy? Which way?" he asked Rusty, who panted beside him on the rocky outcrop. The dog merely tilted his head, his amber eyes trusting but offering no direction. The first day had been the hardest emotionally, at least. Every step taking him farther from the graves of his parents, marked only by simple wooden crosses. He'd walked until his legs ached, pushing through the dull fog of grief. Rusty always a few steps ahead or behind, as if guarding him from unseen threats. They'd slept that night in the hollow of an ancient spruce. Rusty's warm body curled protectively around him. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of rushing snow and his father's final shout. The second day brought hunger and the realization that his meager supplies wouldn't last. He'd set a few basic snares as his father had taught him, catching a single rabbit that he'd cooked over a small fire. The hot meal had restored some of his strength, but reality was setting in. He was a child alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. "Dad always said the mountain doesn't care if you're scared," he reminded himself, voice cracking slightly. "So I won't be scared," but he was, especially when they'd encountered the mountain lion yesterday afternoon. They'd been following a game trail when Rusty froze, hackles rising along his spine. The low growl in the dog's throat sent ice through Eli's veins. Then he saw it, tawny fur against grey stone, watching them with unblinking eyes from a ledge above. For what felt like an eternity, boy and predator locked eyes. Eli remembered his father's lessons. Make yourself big, don't run, don't turn your back. Somehow, his trembling body had complied, arms spreading wide as he backed slowly away, Rusty still between him and the cat, teeth bared in warning. Whether it was Rusty's protective display or simply that the cat wasn't hungry enough to risk the fight, it eventually slunk away, disappearing over the ridge with a flick of its long tail. Eli had run then, fear giving his tired legs new energy, not stopping until the stitch in his side forced him to double over, gasping. Now, on this third day, the weather had turned against them. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through his woolen jacket. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and with it, Eli's hope of finding his way to his uncle's village. "We need shelter before that storm hits," he told Rusty, who whined in agreement. They descended from the ridge, heading toward a dense patch of forest that might offer some protection from the elements. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they reached the tree line, quickly turning to a freezing sleet that stung Eli's cheeks. His numb fingers fumbled with the map again, trying to mark their approximate position based on the peaks he could still make out through the gathering gloom. But the landmarks here were unfamiliar. This was farther than he'd ever ventured, even with his father. The sleet turned to snow as darkness began to fall, the flakes swirling in disorienting patterns that made it hard to maintain direction. Rusty pressed close to his side now, seemingly as aware as Eli that they were in serious trouble. "Just a little farther," Eli encouraged, though he had no idea where they were heading. "We'll find somewhere to wait out the storm." As if in answer to an unspoken prayer, the trees suddenly thinned, revealing a small clearing. And there, almost hidden among the pines, stood the dark outline of a structure, a cabin, its windows empty, eyes staring back at him through the swirling snow. "Look, Rusty," Eli whispered, hope flickering to life in his chest. "Someone lives out here after all." But as they approached, boots crunching through fresh snow, something about the cabin's stillness gave him pause. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light shone from within. Rusty sniffed the air and growled softly. The rusty axe head gleamed dully in the beam of Eli's flashlight, its wooden handle long since rotted away. He set it carefully beside the door where he could find it again if needed. At least the axe proved someone had lived here once. Someone human. "Hello," Eli called out, his voice sounding small in the cabin's musty interior. Only silence answered him. After hesitating at the threshold, Rusty at his heels, Eli had finally worked up the courage to push open the cabin door. It had swung inward with a groan of protest, revealing a single room about 15 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while the opposite held a crude bunk built into the log structure itself. A rough-hewn table lay overturned in the center of the room. Something about its position, not just fallen but violently flipped, made the hair rise on the back of Eli's neck. The storm outside intensified, wind howling through the trees and rattling the cabin's single window. Snow drifted in through gaps in the walls, forming small piles on the plank floor. Despite the cold, Eli detected an underlying odor, musky and wild, that reminded him of the time his father had dispatched a wolf that had been killing the village sheep. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in a long time," Eli whispered to Rusty, who remained unusually tense, ears pricked forward, nose working overtime. "At least not anyone human," he added, eyeing deep grooves in the wooden doorframe. The wind shrieked louder, as if determined to tear the small cabin from its foundation. With the temperature plummeting and nightfall upon them, Eli knew they had little choice but to stay, at least until morning. "We'll be safer in here than out in the storm," he reasoned, trying to convince himself as much as Rusty. "Let's see if we can get a fire going." The fireplace contained old ashes, and a small stack of split logs stood nearby, dusty but dry. Using his father's flint and steel, Eli coaxed a small flame to life, feeding it carefully until it caught the larger pieces of wood. Golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing more details of their shelter. The cabin had clearly been abandoned in haste. Apart from the overturned table and scattered logs, Eli found a metal pot, dented but usable, and a jar of what might have once been preserves, though its contents had long since turned to an unidentifiable mush. No clothing, no personal items. Whoever had lived here had taken those at least. But as the fire grew stronger, casting its light into the darker corners, Eli noticed something else: claw marks. Not just the few scratches he'd initially seen on the doorframe, but long, deliberate gouges in the walls, the table legs, even the edge of the stone fireplace. Some were old, weathered smooth by time, while others looked disturbingly fresh, the wood still pale where it had been splintered. Eli's throat went dry. "Rusty," he whispered, "I don't think this is a person's home anymore." The dog whined softly in response, pressing closer to Eli's side. Despite his growing unease, exhaustion tugged at Eli's limbs. 3 days of walking through difficult terrain, the emotional weight of his loss, and the simple fact of being 12 years old and completely alone except for his dog. It all crashed down on him at once. He dragged the mattress, a canvas sack stuffed with dried grass and pine needles, from the bunk to the floor in front of the fire, positioning it where he could keep his back to the wall and still watch both the door and window. Using his small hunting knife, he wedged the overturned table against the door, creating a makeshift barricade that would at least alert them if something tried to enter. "Just until morning," he told Rusty, who lay with his head on his paws, eyes gleaming in the firelight, fixed on the door. "Then we'll figure out where we are and head for Uncle Joe's." Eli didn't fully believe his own words. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, he wasn't entirely sure which direction to take. The map he'd drawn was soaked through, the charcoal lines blurred beyond recognition. As he lay down beside Rusty, one hand resting on the dog's back, he felt something hard beneath the thin mattress. Reaching underneath, his fingers closed around a smooth wooden handle. The axe head he'd found outside had a mate. This handle, though worn smooth by years of use, was solid oak, the blade missing but the metal collar that had once held it still attached. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Clutching the handle to his chest, Eli finally surrendered to sleep, the fire crackling beside him and Rusty standing guard. The claw mark on the cabin wall seemed to grow larger in the flickering firelight. 4 parallel gouges, each nearly an inch deep, spaced precisely as if left by a single swipe of some massive paw. Eli traced his fingers over the rough edges, measuring the width against his splayed hand. His palm barely covered half the distance between the outer marker. "That's not from a bobcat," he whispered to Rusty, who lay alert by the fire, ears swiveling toward every creak and groan of the cabin as the storm battered it. "Not even a mountain lion." The wind howled down the chimney, sending sparks dancing across the hearth. Outside, the blizzard had intensified, transforming the forest into a howling white void. Eli added another log to the fire, grateful for the small stock of dry wood. Without it, they would have been shivering in darkness. Sleep refused to come. Each time his eyelids grew heavy, some new sound from beyond the walls would jerk him back to alertness. A branch scraping against the roof, the distant crack of a snow-laden tree giving way. Once a long, low sound that might have been the wind, but reminded Eli too much of something else, something alive. Rusty heard it too. The dog's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's nothing, boy," Eli said, trying to convince himself as much as the dog. "Just the storm." But as midnight approached, marked by the small travel clock in Eli's pack, the sounds changed. Something moved outside, not the random chaos of wind and snow, but deliberate, heavy steps that crunched in the drift-covered clearing. Rusty was on his feet in an instant, teeth bared, the growl in his throat shifting to a higher pitch that Eli recognized as fear, rather than aggression. "Quiet," Eli hissed, grabbing for the axe handle. Heart pounding, he pressed his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door where his makeshift barricade still held. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence fell, so complete that Eli could hear the blood rushing in his ear. A sudden thump against the cabin's rear wall made him jump. Then another, harder this time, as if something large was testing the structure's strength. The logs groaned, but held. A gust of wind blew snow through the window's broken corner pane, dusting the floor with white. In the silence that followed, Eli heard sniffing, deep, powerful inhalations, just outside the glass. Rusty's nerve broke. The dog barked once, twice, the sound explosively loud in the confined space. The sniffing stopped abruptly. Then came a sound that froze Eli's blood. A deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the very logs of the cabin walls. No wolf made a sound like that. Nothing he had ever heard in the mountains made a sound like that. "Bear," he breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It's a bear." The creature outside responded with a roar that seemed to shake the foundation stones. Eli clapped his hands over his ears, his mind racing. Bears were supposed to hibernate through the winter. That's what his father had always told him. Unless the unseasonable weather patterns had disrupted their normal cycles, or unless this was its den, and the storm had driven it back to shelter where it found intruders. For nearly an hour, the standoff continued. The bear would circle, sniff, occasionally push against the walls or door, while inside, Eli clutched his inadequate weapon, and Rusty alternated between growling and trembling. Eventually, the sounds receded, the bear either losing interest or deciding to wait for easier access to its home. As the night deepened, exhaustion finally claimed Eli. Despite his terror, his eyes grew heavy, his grip on the axe handle loosening. Just before he drifted off, a strange thought entered his mind. He and the bear weren't so different. Both had lost their homes. Both were seeking shelter from the storm. The thought followed him into uneasy dreams, where he ran through endless snow, while something massive pursued him, its hot breath on his neck, its roar filling the world. He awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The fire had died down to embers, casting the cabin in deep shadow. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Rusty stood rigid by the window, a low whine escaping his throat. Dawn light filtered weakly through the glass, illuminating what had captured the dog's attention. a single massive paw print pressed into the fresh snow outside, clear as a signature, and beside it, barely visible in the growing light, lay something that made Eli's heart skip, a clump of thick, dark fur caught on a nail protruding from the window frame. The bear had been inches away, separated from them by only a thin pane of glass, and something told Eli it would be back. The torn paper crackled between Eli's fingers as he carefully unfolded it, brushing away the dust. Only the top portion remained legible, the rest having been ripped away or disintegrated with age and moisture. Bold black letters spelled out notice across the top, with the seal of the Forest Service still visible in the corner. Warning: increased bear activity reported in this area. Multiple sightings of adult female with the rest was missing. But Eli didn't need to read further. His suspicions were confirmed. He had found the ranger notice wedged behind a loose board near the fireplace while searching for more firewood in the grey morning light. "We're in bear country, Rusty," he said quietly, the dog watching him with attentive eye. Not just any bears, a mother with cubs. The revelation made their situation infinitely more dangerous. His father had always emphasized that nothing in these mountains was more unpredictable or aggressive than a mother bear protecting her young. Now that daylight illuminated the cabin, Eli conducted a more thorough inspection. What he had taken for general disarray in the darkness now revealed a more troubling pattern. The overturned furniture, the scattered items, it wasn't random damage. It was a home that had been systematically taken over and adapted to a new occupant's needs. In one corner, he discovered a depression in the dirt floor, roughly circular, and lined with what looked like dried grass and pine needles. A bed, but not one made by human hand. Near it, scattered animal bones, picked clean but relatively fresh, suggested recent meals. This isn't just a bear's territory, Eli realized with growing dread. This is a bear's den. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a brilliant blue sky and a landscape transformed by snow. Through the window, Eli could see pristine white stretching in all directions, broken only by the dark trunks of pine trees and a single trail of massive paw pips leading away from the cabin. "It's gone for now," he told Rusty, who remained unusually subdued, keeping close to Eli's side. "But it'll be back. This is its home." The logical course of action was clear. They needed to leave immediately, put as much distance as possible between themselves and this place before the bear returned. But uncertainty gnawed at him. The snow lay deep on the ground, hiding trails and landmarks. He had no clear idea which direction would lead to safety, and wandering blindly could be a death sentence in these mountains. His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind. "When you're lost or in doubt, shelter is your priority. Better to stay put somewhere safe than walk yourself to death." But this shelter was far from safe. Eli checked his supplies. The small amount of food he'd brought from the village was nearly gone. Just a handful of jerky strips and some dried fruit remained. The water from his canteen had sustained them so far, but he would need to refill it soon. Perhaps melting snow if he couldn't find a stream. "We need more information before we go anywhere," he decided, speaking aloud to Rusty as he often did when thinking through problems. "We need to know where we are, which way to go." An idea struck him. Perhaps there was something in the cabin that could help. A map, a compass, anything left by whoever had built this place originally. With renewed purpose, he began a methodical search, checking every nook and cranny. Under the bunk frame, he found several rusted cans, their labels long since rotted away. In a corner cupboard, some moldy blankets and a broken oil lamp. Nothing useful. Then, as he examined the stone fireplace more closely, he noticed something peculiar. One of the rocks near the floor was shaped differently than the others, almost perfectly square, with faint marks etched into its surface. Kneeling, Eli brushed away years of accumulated ash to reveal crude initials, JT, and beneath them, a date from nearly 50 years ago. And below that, barely visible, an arrow pointing east with what looked like the word station or shelter. A direction. Eli breathed excitement momentarily overriding his fear. Someone left a direction. He glanced at his father's compass, confirming which way east lay from the cabin. Through the window he could see a ridge in that direction, perhaps a mile distant. "That's where we'll go," he told Rusty, who wagged his tail cautiously, responding to the lift in Eli's voice. "As soon as we—" A sound from outside cut him off, the distinct crack of a branch breaking under significant weight. Both boy and dog froze, eyes locked on the door they had barricaded once again before sleeping. Something was moving in the trees just beyond the clearing, something large. The broken radio lay in Eli's palm, its cracked display and missing antenna telling him all he needed to know. Useless. He set it down with a sigh, surveying the remains of what had once been a small Forest Service outpost. After the sound outside the cabin had faded, a false alarm, perhaps just snow falling from an overloaded branch, Eli had decided they couldn't stay put any longer. Following the etched arrow's direction, he and Rusty had set out eastward, through the deep snow, the boy breaking trail while the dog bounded along behind him. The trek had been arduous, the snow sometimes reaching midway up Eli's thighs, but the clear weather held, and his father's compass kept them moving steadily east toward the distant ridge. After nearly 2 hours of difficult hiking, they'd crested a small rise to discover this dilapidated structure nestled among a stand of ancient pines. Not much remained, just a single room with half its roof caved in, Forest Service insignia still barely visible on the weathered door. Time and the harsh mountain elements had claimed most of whatever had once been here, but Eli had searched anyway, hoping against hope for something useful. The radio had been his most promising find, tucked inside a metal box that had protected it from the worst of the elements. A moment of excitement had flared when he'd first spotted it, a connection to the outside world, a way to call for help. Reality had quickly doused that spark. Even if the radio hadn't been broken beyond repair, who would he call? What would he say? "Hello, I'm lost somewhere in the mountains with a bear after me." Without coordinates or landmarks, no one would be able to find him. "At least we know people come up here sometimes," Eli told Rusty, who was investigating the outpost's perimeter, nose to the ground. "Maybe there's a trail that leads somewhere." The dog suddenly froze, ears perked forward, staring intently at something beyond the trees. Eli tensed, hand automatically reaching for the knife at his belt. But Rusty's posture wasn't alarmed, curious rather than frightened. Following the dog's gaze, Eli spotted what had captured his attention, a flash of movement near a break in the tree line. Something small and quick. Not a bear. "Stay," he commanded softly, moving cautiously toward the spot. As he approached, he caught another glimpse, the white tail of a snowshoe hare disappearing into the underbrush. Eli smiled, the first genuine smile since leaving the village. Game meant food, and food meant a chance to replenish his dwindling supplies. Returning to the outpost, he gathered what he could salvage, a metal cup with only minor dents, a partial roll of duct tape, and a faded map tacked to the wall. The map was largely illegible, water damage having blurred most of the markings, but one corner remained somewhat intact, showing what might be a lake or large pond with a small square marker beside it. Another structure, perhaps. A destination. As Eli tucked these meager findings into his pack, something else caught his eye, a disturbance in the vegetation around the outpost. Not random winter die-off, but a pattern of broken branches and trampled undergrowth, forming a rough corridor leading deeper into the forest. A trail, faint and overgrown, but definitely a trail. "Look, Rusty," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "This might lead somewhere." The dog cocked his head, seemingly understanding the importance of the discovery. Before setting out, Eli decided to gather more firewood. If they couldn't find better shelter by nightfall, they'd need to make camp, and the temperature would drop rapidly after sunset. As he collected fallen branches near the edge of the clearing, he noticed something odd about the tree trunks. Long, vertical scratches ran up the bark of several pines, too high for a smaller animal, too deliberate for random damage. Bear marks, territory markers. A chill ran down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. They were still in bear country, still in danger. Worse, as he examined the marks more closely, he realized some were fresh, the exposed inner bark still light-colored and oozing sap despite the cold. "Recent," he murmured, glancing nervously around the quiet forest. "Very recent." From somewhere in the distance came a sound, faint but unmistakable, a low, rumbling growl that carried through the still air. Rusty whined, pressing against Eli's leg. "I know, boy," Eli whispered, gathering his pack with trembling hands. "We need to move." They set off down the faint trail, Eli constantly checking the compass to ensure they maintained their eastward heading. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, a reminder that daylight was limited. They needed to find shelter, real shelter, before darkness fell. Behind them, barely audible, but definitely there, came the sound of heavy movement through the snow. Deliberate, unhurried, but steady. Following, the clump of dark brown fur clung to Eli's fingertips as he examined it in the fading afternoon light, coarse and thick, with a distinctive musky odor that made Rusty's nose wrinkle. Not just any fur, bear fur. And not just in one place, but everywhere throughout the back portion of the cabin they had returned to. The trek down the faint trail from the ranger outpost had led them in a wide circle, the path eventually disappearing beneath fresh snow. With daylight waning and no new shelter in sight, Eli had made the difficult decision to return to the cabin. Better a known danger than freezing in the open forest. "I know it's not ideal," he'd told Rusty as they approached the clearing again, "but we can barricade ourselves in better this time. And now we know to leave at first light, heading east." The cabin had appeared undisturbed upon their return, the bear apparently not having come back during their absence. But now, as Eli conducted a more thorough exploration of the structure, he discovered a small doorway in the back corner he had overlooked before. A low opening leading to what must have once been a storage space. What he found inside turned his blood to ice. The small room, hardly more than a closet, had been transformed into a den. The floor was lined with pine boughs, grass and fur, a nest of... But it was the other contents that told the real story. A cache of half-eaten prey, bones scattered throughout, and most alarmingly, indentations in the bedding material that suggested not one bear but several cubs. Eli breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It's a mother and cubs." The torn ranger noticed suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't just any bear's territory, it was a mother bear's nursery, perhaps the most dangerous place he could possibly be. Rusty growled softly, hackles rising as he stood in the doorway of the small den room, reluctant to enter further. The smell was overwhelming, even to Eli's less sensitive nose, the musky odor of bear, the metallic tang of old blood, the earthiness of soil and vegetation brought inside. "We need to leave," Eli said, backing away slowly. "Right now, we'll take our chances in the forest." But a glance out the cabin's single window stopped him cold. The sun had nearly set, the forest already plunged into deep blue shadows. Worse, fat snowflakes had begun falling again, suggesting another storm approaching. Leaving now, with no clear destination and darkness falling, would be suicide. They were trapped, forced to spend one more night in a place that belonged, unquestionably, to one of the most dangerous predators in the mountains. Moving with renewed urgency, Eli began fortifying their position. He dragged the heavy bunk frame against the main door, wedging it tight. The small window too narrow for a bear to enter, but still a weak point, he covered with the salvaged boards, nailing them in place using rocks as hammers. The back room, the den, presented the biggest problem. The opening had no door, nothing to block it. Eli's gaze fell on the overturned table. It would just fit the opening if turned on its side. "Help me with this," he told Rusty, though of course the dog could do little but watch as Eli struggled with the heavy piece of furniture, finally maneuvering it into place across the den room's entrance. It wouldn't stop a determined bear, but it might slow one down. Give them warning. Night fell completely as Eli finished his preparations. He built a small fire, just enough for minimal light and warmth, not wanting the smoke to further advertise their presence. Their remaining food, a single strip of jerky, he split with Rusty, washing it down with melted snow. One night he promised the dog as they huddled together near the fire, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Just one more night, then we leave for good, storm or no storm. The wind picked up outside, driving snow against the walls with a sound like shifting sand. Occasionally a stronger gust would cause the cabin to creak and settle, each noise making them both start. It was during one such gust that they heard it, a sound not made by wind or snow or settling timber. A huffing grunt, followed by the unmistakable whine of young animals. They were back, and they were right outside. Rusty's growl was immediate, a rumbling warning that rose from deep in his chest. Eli clamped his hand gently around the dog's muzzle, silencing him. "Quiet," he breathed, heart hammering so loudly he was sure it must be audible across the small room. Not a sound. The improvised spear felt rough against Eli's palm, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. He had fashioned it from a broken table leg, using his pocket knife to whittle one end to a crude point, then hardening it in the fire's embers as his father had once shown him. Not much of a weapon, but better than facing what was outside with just his hands. "It won't kill a bear," his father's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. "But it might buy you a moment, and sometimes a moment is all you need." Outside, the storm had intensified, snow driving horizontally past the cabin's single window. But the weather was now the least of their concerns. Somewhere out there in the swirling white darkness, the bear and her cubs were circling their former home, aware of the intruders inside. Occasionally Eli caught glimpses of movement, a massive shadow passing by the window, the crunch of heavy paws in snow. Once, the entire cabin shuddered as something large brushed against the exterior wall. Each time Rusty tensed beside him, a continuous low growl rumbling in the dog's throat, despite Eli's attempts to quiet him. "She knows we're here," Eli whispered, more to himself than to Rusty, "and she wants us gone." The rational part of his mind couldn't blame her. They were the intruders, after all, sheltering in what had clearly become her den. But the primal part of him, the part concerned only with survival, cared nothing for the bear's territorial rights. They were trapped in a deadly standoff, neither side willing to cede ground, yet neither able to force the other out. For now at least, the barriers Eli had erected were holding. The overturned bunk against the door, the boards nailed across the window, the heavy table blocking the entrance to the den room, sufficient to keep the bear out. But for how long? As the night deepened and the storm's fury mounted, Eli's thoughts turned increasingly desperate. What if the bear decided to wait them out? Their food was already gone, and the wood supply would last another day at most. Even if they could hold out, how would they ever leave? The moment they opened the door, they would be exposed, vulnerable. "We need a plan," he told Rusty, the dog's warm body pressed against his side, providing his only comfort. "We can't just sit here waiting to die." His father's lessons on wilderness survival had covered many scenarios, but being trapped in a bear's den during winter had not been among them. Still, certain principles remained applicable. Assess your resources, understand your environment, identify your opponent's weaknesses. Resources were few: the spear, his knife, a nearly empty pack, the clothes on his back. The environment was against them, a howling blizzard outside, temperatures plummeting with the night. As for the bear's weaknesses, Eli frowned, thinking, bears relied heavily on scent. Their eyesight was decent, but not their primary sense. Their hearing was better than humans, but could be confused by multiple sources of sound. An idea began to form, a desperate plan for morning. Assuming they survived the night, he would need a distraction, something to draw the bear away from the cabin long enough for them to escape in the opposite direction. Fire, perhaps, or sound. Maybe both. The ranger outpost they had found earlier, If they could reach it again, they might follow that faint trail further, find their way to safety. "First light," he whispered to Rusty, who tilted his head as if trying to understand. "That's when we'll go." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin, and for a moment Eli thought he heard wood splitting. He held his breath, listening intently, the spear clutched tightly in his sweating hands. But no further sounds came, no breach in their tenuous sanctuary. Hours passed in tense vigilance. Eli fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep could mean death if the bear found a way inside. But exhaustion weighed on him, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute. Twice he jerked awake from micro-sleeps, heart racing at the momentary disorientation. "Mom," he whispered into the darkness, a sudden wave of grief washing over him. "Dad, I'm scared." The confession, spoken aloud in the quiet cabin, brought unexpected tears to his eyes. For all his attempts at bravery, for all his channeling of his father's wisdom, he was still just a 12-year-old boy lost in the wilderness. Alone except for his loyal dog, facing a danger that would terrify even seasoned adults. Rusty sensed his distress, moving closer to lick the tears from his cheeks. The simple gesture of comfort nearly broke Eli completely, but he forced himself to breathe deeply, to regain control. "We'll make it," he promised the dog, his voice steadier now. "We'll get out of here tomorrow, find our way to Uncle Joe's. You'll have a warm bed and all the food you can eat." A sudden silence fell outside, the wind dropping momentarily. In that brief lull, Eli heard a sound that sent ice through his veins, the soft whimpering of bear cubs, followed by their mother's answering rumble. Close, too close. Eli gripped his spear and waited for dawn. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night's uneasy silence. Eli jolted fully awake, disoriented for only a moment before reality crashed back. The window. Something had broken the window. A massive dark paw, tipped with gleaming claws, withdrew from the jagged opening, taking several of Eli's hastily nailed boards with it. Snow and frigid air immediately rushed in through the breach. Along with a deep, powerful huffing sound, the bear, scenting them directly now. Rusty exploded into furious barking, all Eli's earlier commands for silence forgotten, as the dog positioned himself between the boy and the broken window. The bear responded with a roar that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin, its massive head now visible in the window frame as it tested whether it could force its way through the narrow opening. "Back, Rusty, back!" Eli shouted, dragging the dog away from the window by his collar. If the bear got even one paw properly through that opening, it could easily catch the agitated dog. Eli's mind raced. The window was too small for the adult bear to enter. A blessing, but the broken glass had created a direct pathway for scent and sound between them and the predator. Any hope of waiting undetected until morning was gone. Worse, with the window breached, frigid air would soon make the cabin uninhabitable. The bear's frustration was evident as it continued testing the window, powerful jaws snapping at the remaining boards, claws scraping against the log walls as it sought purchase. Each assault on the cabin brought fresh showers of glass and splinters onto the floor. Through the cacophony of Rusty's barking and the bear's roars, Eli heard another sound that sent a chill through his body, the high-pitched whining of cubs, anxious at their mother's distress. The stakes had just gotten much higher. A mother bear protecting cubs wouldn't retreat easily. "We have to scare her off," Eli muttered, casting about desperately for something, anything that might help. His gaze landed on the small fire, now burning low in the hearth. Fire, bears feared fire. Moving quickly, Eli grabbed one of the remaining logs, its end already charred and smoldering. The makeshift torch wasn't much, but it was all he had. The bear's head appeared again in the window frame, jaws open in a threatening display, eyes gleaming with reflected firelight. Without hesitating, Eli thrust the burning log toward the opening, yelling as loudly as he could, "Get out of here! Go away!" The bear jerked back from the sudden flame, but didn't retreat entirely. Instead, it circled around to the door, the heavy thuds of its movement, clearly audible even over Rusty's continued barking. A tremendous crash against the door made the entire cabin shudder. The bunk frame Eli had wedged against it shifted slightly, but held. Another crash followed, and another. The bear was throwing its full weight against their barrier. It's going to break through, Eli realized with mounting terror. The door and frame were old, the wood softened by years of exposure to the elements. It wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. Each impact was accompanied by the groan of straining wood and the metallic ping of nails beginning to pull free. Rusty's barking had taken on a frantic edge, the dog darting between the window and door, unsure which threat to focus on. In desperation, Eli cast around for anything to reinforce the door. The table was already blocking the den room entrance, the bunk frame against the door. There was nothing else heavy enough to matter. The fire. It was their only chance. Grabbing another burning brand from the fireplace, Eli positioned himself by the door, prepared to confront the bear directly if it broke through. His improvised spear lay ready beside him, a flimsy defense against over 500 pounds of enraged predator, but better than nothing. Another powerful impact, and the door frame splintered at one corner. Through the widening gap, Eli caught a glimpse of dense Lane's fur, the glint of an eye, hot breath condensing in the frigid air. "Rusty, quiet," he commanded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The dog, sensing the gravity of their situation, finally ceased barking, instead taking up position beside Eli, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest. The next impact brought a shower of splinters as one of the door hinges tore partially free. Another blow like that, and they would be face to face with their pursuer. Time seemed to slow as Eli raised the burning branch, his father's words echoing in his memory. "If you ever face a predator, make yourself big, make noise, don't run." Most times they don't want to fight any more than you do. But this wasn't most times. This was a mother bear driven to reclaim her den, her nursery. The normal rules didn't apply. The final impact never came. Instead, the pressure against the door suddenly ceased. A moment of silence followed, broken only by Rusty's continued growling. Then, from outside, came a new sound, the low, huffing grunt of the mother bear calling to her cubs, followed by the crush of snow as the massive animal moved away from the cabin. Relief washed over Eli, but he knew better than to trust it. The bear hadn't given up. It had simply changed tactics. And night was far from over. The hunting knife gleamed in the grey dawn light, filtering through the broken window. Eli turned the blade over in his hands, feeling its familiar weight. His father had given it to him on his 12th birthday, just 3 months ago. "Not a toy," he'd said gravely, "a tool. And someday it might save your life." Someday had arrived sooner than either of them could have imagined. The night had passed in a series of tense standoffs. After the initial attack, the bear had circled the cabin repeatedly, testing different points of entry, but never committing to a full assault. Eli had maintained a vigil by the door, burning torch in hand, listening to every sound with hyper-aware senses. Neither he nor Rusty had slept. Now, as dawn broke, Eli knew they had a small window of opportunity. The bear's movements outside had grown less frequent over the past hour. Perhaps she had retreated temporarily to tend to her cubs or to hunt. What a hunt! Whatever the reason, this might be their only chance to escape. "We need a plan, Rusty," he murmured, the dog watching him with intelligent eyes. "And I think I've got one." His father had taught him that bears, for all their power, had predictable behaviors. They followed routine paths through their territory. They were drawn to food sources. Most importantly, they relied heavily on their acute sense of smell. Eli reached into his pack and withdrew the last item he'd been saving, a small tin of his father's pipe tobacco. The pungent scent filled the cabin as he opened it, making Rusty sneeze. "Sorry, boy," he said, "but this might be what saves us." Bears had sensitive noses, far more sensitive than humans. Strong odors could mask scents or confuse them. The tobacco, combined with fire, might create enough olfactory confusion to cover their escape. Eli laid out the elements of his plan in his mind. First, create a smoky fire with the tobacco to mask their scent. Second, make noise in one direction to draw the bear's attention. Third, slip out the window and escape in the opposite direction. Simple in theory, terrifying in execution. He set to work immediately, gathering the remaining firewood and positioning it in the center of the cabin, rather than the fireplace. On top, he sprinkled a generous portion of the tobacco. He wouldn't light it until the last moment, but everything needed to be ready. Next, he tore strips from the moldy blanket he'd found under the bunk, tying them around the end of his improvised spear to create a torch that would burn longer than just a bare branch. The final piece of his plan was the most uncertain, a noise diversion. He needed something that would continue making sound after they left, drawing the bear's attention away from their escape route. His gaze fell on the dented metal pot he'd found earlier. If he could rig it to fall repeatedly, making noise. Working quickly, Eli used the remaining strips of blanket to create a simple pulley system. He tied the pot to one end of a fabric strip, ran the strip over a ceiling beam, and tied the other end to a chunk of firewood, balanced precariously on the table barricading the den room entrance. When the wood burned through, the pot would crash down, then be pulled back up by a counterweight, only to fall again when the fabric strip burned through at a strategic point. It wasn't perfect, but it might buy them precious minutes. "What do you think?" he asked Rusty, who watched his preparations with anxious eyes. The dog whined softly, clearly sensing the gravity of their situation. Eli checked and rechecked his preparations, pack secured tightly to his back, knife sheathed at his belt, compass in his pocket. The window cleared of remaining glass shards to provide an escape route. Everything ready. Now they just needed to confirm the bear's location. Moving cautiously to the window, Eli peered out into the snowy clearing. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape bathed in early morning light. He scanned the tree lines systematically, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then Rusty growled, his attention fixed on the far side of the clearing. Following the dog's gaze, Eli finally spotted her. The mother bear, partially hidden among the pines, watching the cabin with unnerving stillness. Nearby, two small cubs tumbled in the snow, seemingly unaware of the tension between their mother and the cabin's occupants. Seeing the cubs in daylight hammered home the reality of their situation. They weren't just dealing with a territorial bear, they were caught between a mother and her vulnerability, her offspring. There could be no more dangerous position. "She's too close," Eli whispered, his earlier confidence faltering. "We'll never make it across the clearing without her seeing us." But what choice did they have? The cabin was no longer secure with the broken window and damaged door. Their supplies were gone. Staying meant certain confrontation when the bear decided to reclaim her den. They had to try. "Okay," Ali said, drawing a deep breath as he turned to Rusty. "Here's what we're going to do." He knelt beside the dog, looking directly into his loyal eyes. For all his plans and preparations, Eli knew that everything would come down to timing, luck, and the bond between boy and dog. They would need to move as one, without hesitation, when the moment came. "When I say run, we run. No barking, no stopping, just run." Rusty seemed to understand, pressing his cold nose briefly against Eli's cheek. "Let's go home, boy." The massive paw print in the snow told Eli everything he needed to know. Nearly 8 inches across, with 5 distinct claw marks extending beyond the pad impressions. This was no ordinary black bear. This was a grizzly, one of the largest and most dangerous predators in the mountain. From his position at the window, he could now clearly see the mother bear and her cubs in the morning light. She was enormous, her fur a mix of dark brown and silver-tipped guard hairs that gave grizzlies their grizzled appearance. At least 6 feet long and likely weighing over 500 pounds, she moved with surprising grace for her size, her powerful muscles shifting beneath thick winter fur. The cubs, two of them were much smaller, perhaps 40 pounds each. Born the previous winter, they would stay with their mother for another year or more, learning the skills they would need to survive on their own. They tumbled and played in the fresh snow while their mother maintained her vigil, eyes fixed on the cabin that had been their den, until Eli and Rusty's arrival. "She's protecting them," Eli whispered to Rusty, who stood tense beside him, eyes locked on the bear. "That's why she won't leave, why she's so determined to get back inside." A memory surfaced, his father pointing out a partially excavated hollow beneath a fallen tree during one of their hikes. "Their den," he'd explained. "They need a safe, dry place to birth their cubs in winter. Once they've found a good den site, they'll often return to it year after year." Eli's heart sank as he realized the full implications. This wasn't just any shelter the bear was trying to reclaim. It was her nursery, the place where her cubs had likely been born, where she had kept them safe through their vulnerable early months. No wonder she was so persistent. The cabin wasn't just shelter to her, it was home. A sudden wave of empathy washed over him. Hadn't he also lost his home? Didn't he understand the desperate need for shelter and safety? The two cubs wrestled near the edge of the clearing, their mother occasionally glancing their way, but never fully turning her attention from the cabin. Their playful antics reminded Eli painfully of roughhousing, with his own father, of feeling safe and protected within his family. "We're not so different," he murmured, "just trying to survive." This realization didn't make their situation any less dangerous, but it shifted something in Eli's thinking. Until now, he had seen the bear as merely a threat, an obstacle to overcome. Now he recognized her as another being, with needs and motivations he could understand, a mother protecting her family. Understanding his opponent gave him new insight into her likely behavior. She wouldn't give up easily. She wouldn't be fooled for long by simple distractions. And most importantly, she would risk everything to keep her cubs safe. Any plan that put those cubs in perceived danger would bring her full fury down upon them. Eli watched as one of the cubs strayed a bit too far toward the forest's edge. The mother bear immediately gave a low grunt, and the cub obediently returned to safer ground. The communication between them was clear and effective, another parallel to his own lost family. His chest tightened with grief and longing. What would his own mother do now? What would his father advise? The answer came to him with surprising clarity: avoid confrontation at all costs. His father had always emphasized that the best way to deal with large predators was to avoid them entirely. Give them space, he'd say. Respect their territory. Most attacks happen because people surprise bears or get between mothers and cubs. They were already in the worst possible position between a mother and her home. Their only hope was to remove themselves from the equation without triggering her protective instincts. Eli's original plan needed adjustment. Creating a distraction with fire and noise was still necessary, but their escape route had to take the cubs' location into account. They needed to move away from the cabin without getting any closer to the cubs than they already were. Studying the clearing, Eli noted that the mother bear positioned herself between the cabin and her cubs. That meant their best escape route was in the opposite direction, even though it would take them deeper into the forest rather than toward the trail he'd found earlier. Direction didn't matter now, distance did. They needed to put as much space as possible between themselves and the bear family as quickly as possible. "Change of plan," he whispered to Rusty, who tilted his head attentively. "We're not going east anymore. We're going wherever she is." The dog seemed to understand, his intelligent eyes moving between Eli and the bears outside. With renewed purpose, Eli returned to his preparations. The tobacco-laced fire, the noise diversion, but now with a clearer understanding of exactly what path they would take, and why the timing had to be perfect. One mistake, one false step or sound at the wrong moment, and the mother's protective instincts would turn their escape into a deadly pursuit. Bears could run faster than humans over short distances, reaching speeds of 35 miles per hour. Their only advantage would be the bear's reluctance to leave her cubs unprotected. Eli took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "Just like Dad taught us," he told Rusty. "Calm, deliberate, no sudden movements." Outside, one of the cubs stood on its hind legs, batting at a low-hanging pine branch, sending a shower of snow cascading down. For just a moment, the mother bear's attention was diverted, her gaze shifting to her playful offspring. Eli's hand moved to the matches in his pocket. It was time. The torn backpack dangled from a broken branch, a tattered flag marking their hasty passage. Eli reached for it in desperation, but it was too far gone, ripped nearly in half, most of his remaining supplies scattered somewhere in the snow below. He clung to the rough bark of the pine tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps, legs trembling from the frantic climb. 20 feet below, Rusty huddled against the trunk, whimpering softly, a smear of red staining the fur on his right foreleg. And beyond him, circling the base of the tree with deliberate, heavy steps, was the mother bear, her huffing breaths visible in the cold mountain air. The escape plan had gone catastrophically wrong. It had started well enough. Eli had set the tobacco-laced fire in the center of the cabin, creating a thick, pungent smoke. He'd triggered his noise diversion, sending the metal pot clattering to the floor repeatedly. Then, with Rusty tight against his side, he'd slipped through the broken window and begun moving quickly but quietly away from both the cabin and the playing cubs. For the first 100 yards, it seemed to be working. The mother bear's attention had remained fixed on the cabin, her powerful frame tense but stationary as she assessed the smoke beginning to curl from the broken window and the strange clanging sounds from within. Then, everything had fallen apart. A sudden gust of wind had shifted, carrying their scent directly to the bear. The moment she caught it, her entire demeanor had changed. Head swinging toward them, nostrils flaring, she'd risen to her full height on hind legs, a terrifying 7 feet of muscle and fury. The roar that followed seemed to shake the very air. Eli had abandoned all pretense of stealth, then breaking into a flat run, with Rusty bounding ahead. Behind them, the mother bear had dropped to all fours and begun pursuit, covering ground with frightening speed. Their only salvation had been the dense forest they'd fled into, the close-set trunks slowing the much larger bear. Even so, she had gained on them steadily, her powerful form crashing through underbrush that Eli and Rusty had been able to slip through. When she'd gotten close enough for Eli to hear her breathing, raw instinct had taken over. Spotting a tall pine with low branches, he'd shouted to Rusty, "Up, go up!" The dog, trained to climb trees with him since puppyhood, had responded instantly, scrambling up the rough bark with Eli right behind. But they hadn't been fast enough. As Rusty reached the lower branches, the bear had swiped at him, claws grazing his leg. The dog's yelp of pain still echoed in Eli's ears. Only Eli's desperate kick at the bear's muzzle, a foolish, instinctive act that could have cost him his leg, had given Rusty the moment he needed to scramble higher. Now they were trapped, the bear pacing below, occasionally standing to test the lower branches with her massive paws. The cubs had followed their mother at a distance and now watched from the edge of the small clearing, their presence ensuring she wouldn't abandon the standoff. Eli's backpack had caught on a branch during the climb, tearing open and spilling most of his remaining supplies. His precious compass had tumbled into the snow below, the water canteen had followed. All he had left were the clothes he wore, his father's knife strapped to his belt, and a single energy bar still stuffed in his pocket. "It's okay, boy," he called down to Rusty, trying to keep his voice steady. "She can't reach us up here. But for how long?" Bears were excellent climbers when motivated. This tree's trunk might be too narrow for her weight, but he couldn't be certain, and even if she couldn't reach them, she could easily outlast them. The temperature was dropping again, and without supplies, exposure would become as deadly a threat as the bear's claws. Rusty whined again, shifting his weight on the branch, careful of his injured leg. The wound didn't appear deep, more of a graze than a puncture, but in these conditions any injury could become dangerous. "We'll be all right," Eli said, as much to convince himself as to comfort the dog. "She'll lose interest eventually." But the mother bear showed no signs of giving up. She circled the tree methodically, testing the soil around its base as if considering whether she could topple it entirely. Occasionally she would rear up, reaching toward the lowest branches, but stopping just short of where Rusty perched. The afternoon sun had begun its descent behind the mountains, shadows lengthening across the snow. Night would bring bitter cold, especially up in the branches exposed to the wind. Without shelter, without fire, they wouldn't last until morning. Eli fought against rising panic, forcing himself to think. His father's voice seemed to echo in his mind. "When you're out of options, look again. There's always something you've missed." He scanned their surroundings from his elevated position. The forest stretched in all directions, seemingly identical. But wait there, perhaps half a mile distant, was that a thin column of smoke rising above the trees. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Hope flickered in his chest. If someone else was in these mountains, they might have a radio, a way to call for help, or at least a secure shelter where a bear couldn't follow. But first, they had to get down from this tree and away from their enraged guardian. Eli glanced at the darkening sky, calculating. Bears had excellent daytime vision, but relied more on smell and hearing at night. If they waited until full dark, then created a diversion, a plan began to form in his mind. Risky, desperate, but better than slowly freezing to death in the branches of a pine tree. "Just a little longer," he told Rusty, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes. "Night's coming. And then we'll make our move." Below, the mother bear settled on her haunches, her patience a match for their predicament. The waiting game had begun. The lightning-struck tree stood like a blackened sentinel against the churning sky, its splintered trunk still smoking despite the pelting rain. Eli stared at it in awe and relief, the crash of thunder that had followed its destruction still echoing through the mountain. Never had he been so grateful for a storm. For hours, they had remained trapped in the pine tree, the mother bear maintaining her vigil below as darkness fell. The temperature had dropped steadily, and Eli's fingers and toes had grown numb, his thin jacket providing little protection against the biting wind. Rusty had huddled on his branch, occasionally whimpering from pain or cold, but never making enough noise to further agitate the bear. Eli had been counting on darkness to aid their escape, but what came instead was far more effective. A mountain thunderstorm, rolling in just after midnight with shocking suddenness and ferocity. The first lightning strike had hit miles away, the distant rumble of thunder causing the bear to raise her head in alert concern. The cubs, who had settled at the forest's edge, began whimpering anxiously. The second strike was closer, illuminating the entire clearing in brilliant blue-white light. By the third strike, the one that had split the dead pine just 50 yards away, the mother bear's priorities had shifted dramatically. With a series of urgent grunts, she had called her cubs to her, then led them swiftly away from the clearing, away from the perceived danger from above, that no amount of tree guarding could protect them from. Nature had provided what Eli's planning could not. A force more threatening than humans, a danger that sent even the mountain's most formidable predator seeking shelter. "Now's our chance," Eli had whispered to Rusty, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "We have to go now." The descent from their refuge had been treacherous, the bark slick with rain, his numbed fingers struggling to hand purchase. Rusty had managed better, despite his injured leg, his claws giving him traction that Eli lacked. When they finally reached the ground, both were soaked to the skin and shivering violently, but free. Eli had oriented himself toward the distant smoke he'd spotted earlier, though it would be idyllic now in the darkness and storm. Using the occasional lightning flashes to navigate, they had set off at a stumbling run, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the bear family's territory. Now, an hour into their desperate journey, they had reached a small stream swollen with rainwater. Eli knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink the icy water. Rusty lapped at it gratefully, then allowed Eli to examine his wounded leg in the next lightning flash. The cut wasn't as bad as Eli had feared, a shallow gash about 3 inches long that had mostly stopped bleeding. Still, in these conditions, any injury was dangerous. Infection could set in quickly. "We need to clean this properly," Eli told the dog, tearing a strip from the bottom of his shirt to create a makeshift bandage. He soaked it in the stream, then gently wrapped it around Rusty's leg, tying it snugly but not tight enough to restrict circulation. The rain continued to fall in sheets, driven horizontally by gusting winds that threatened to knock Eli off his feet. They couldn't stay exposed like this much longer. Hypothermia was a very real danger now. "Come on," he urged Rusty, rising on legs, stiff with cold. "We need to find shelter." They followed the stream downhill, reasoning that water always took the path of least resistance. In the mountains, streams often led to valleys where they might find better protection from the elements. The lightning strikes became less frequent as the storm began to move on, making it harder to see their way. Eli stumbled repeatedly over hidden rocks and roots, once nearly falling into the stream itself. Rusty stayed close, occasionally pushing against Eli's leg to steady him. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 30 minutes, the stream widened and the terrain leveled slightly. In the dim light between lightning flashes, Eli made out a rock formation ahead. Not just random boulders, but an overhang creating a shallow cave. "There," he shouted over the wind, pointing for Rusty's benefit. The dog bounded ahead despite his injury, sensing shelter. The overhang wasn't deep, perhaps 6 feet from entrance to back wall, but it was dry underneath and protected from the wind. A perfect emergency shelter. Collapsing onto the stone floor, Eli pulled Rusty close against him for warmth. The dog's fur was soaked, but his body still radiated heat that Eli desperately needed. "We made it, boy," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "Thanks to that storm." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same natural force that had nearly buried his village in an avalanche had now likely saved their lives by driving away the bear. Nature gave and took with equal indifference to human concerns. As the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, exhaustion washed over Eli in waves. He fought to keep his eyes open, knowing that sleep in his wet clothes could be dangerous. But the events of the past 2 days, the terror, the cold, the constant vigilance had drained him completely. "Just a short rest," he told Rusty, who licked his face in response. "Then we'll follow the smoke." Outside, the storm gradually began to subside, the time between lightning and thunder growing longer. The rain softened to a steady patter rather than the earlier deluge. Eli's last conscious thought before drifting into an exhausted sleep was of the mother bear and her cubs. He hoped they too had found shelter from the storm. Strange to feel concern for the creature that had nearly killed them. But in the end, they were all just trying to survive in these mountains that belonged to none of them, and all of them at once. The bear claw lay in Eli's palm, nearly 4 inches long, and curved like a scimitar. He had found it caught in Rusty's bandage when changing the dressing that morning, a grim souvenir of their encounter, and a reminder of how close they had come to death. "You're lucky she only grazed you," he told the dog, who stood patiently as Eli rewrapped his injured leg with a fresh strip of cloth torn from his increasingly tattered shirt. The wound looked clean, showing no signs of infection, a sole mercy in their continuing ordeal. Dawn had brought clearer weather, the storm having passed during the night. Their rock overhang had kept them dry, though Eli's clothes had remained damp and uncomfortable. He'd woken stiff and shivering, but alive and with renewed determination to find the source of the smoke he'd spotted the previous day. From their elevated position on the mountainside, Eli scanned the terrain below. The stream they'd followed continued its descent into a broader valley, where the forest thinned slightly, and there, perhaps 2 miles distant, he spotted it again. A thin column of smoke rising above the trees, more visible now in the clear morning light. "That's where we're heading," he told Rusty, pointing toward the smoke. "People, Maybe a ranger station or a hunting cabin. The dog wagged his tail, seemingly understanding the importance of their destination. Despite his injury, he appeared eager to move, restless after their night in the cramped shelter. They set off down the slope, following the stream as it wound its way toward the valley. Eli moved more cautiously now, aware that they were still in bear country and that their encounter the previous day might not be their last. Every few minutes he would stop, scanning their surroundings and listening intently for any sound that didn't belong to wind or water. It was during one such pause, about an hour into their journey, that he first noticed the tracks. Large paw prints in the mud, near the stream's edge, fresher than they should be, pointing in the same direction they were traveling. Eli felt his mouth go dry. "She's ahead of us," he whispered to Rusty, who had already noticed, his hackles rising slightly, as he sniffed the tracks. The storm must have driven her this way too. The realization complicated their already desperate situation. The smoke that promised salvation might lie directly in the path of the mother bear and her cubs, or worse, the bear might be between them and safety. Eli considered their options. They could try to circle wide around the bear's path, but that would mean leaving the stream, their only reliable guide and water source. They could wait and hope the bear moved on, but they had no food, and Rusty's wound needed proper treatment. Or they could continue forward, but with even greater caution, hoping to avoid another encounter. "Forward," Eli decided, speaking softly to Rusty. "But we'll be smarter this time." He fashioned a crude walking stick from a fallen branch, partly to help navigate the rough terrain, partly as a potential defensive tool, though what good a stick would do against 500 pounds of maternal fury, he tried not to contemplate. They continued downstream, but now Eli chose their path more deliberately, keeping to higher ground where possible to maintain better visibility. Rusty moved ahead, his keen nose and ears providing early warning of potential threat. Around midday, they paused at a small cascade where the stream tumbled over a rocky ledge. Eli cupped his hands to drink, then sat on a sun-warmed boulder to rest briefly. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him that it had been nearly a full day since his last proper meal. The shared jerky in the cabin seemed like a lifetime ago. As if reading his thoughts, Rusty suddenly perked up, nose twitching. Before Eli could react, the dog bounded into the underbrush, returning moments later with a fat ground squirrel in his jaws. "Good boy," Eli exclaimed, genuinely impressed. He'd known Rusty could hunt. The dog had often brought back small game when they explored the forests near their village, but hadn't expected him to manage it with an injured leg. The squirrel wasn't much, but it was food. Using his father's knife, Eli quickly dressed the small animal and built a tiny, nearly smokeless fire using the driest wood he could find. The cooked meat, though tough and gamey, was the most delicious thing he could remember eating. Their hunger somewhat satisfied, they continued their journey with renewed energy. The valley broadened, the stream joining a larger river that curved toward the distant smoke. Hope began to build in Eli's chest. Perhaps their ordeal was nearly over. Then Rusty froze, ears forward, a low growl building in his throat. Following the dog's gaze, Eli spotted movement on a ridge about a quarter-mile ahead, a large brown form moving with deliberate purpose, followed by two smaller shapes. The bear family, and they were heading directly toward the source of the smoke. "No," Eli breathed, sudden dread washing through him. If there were people at that smoke source, rangers, hunters, hikers, they might not see the bears coming. Or worse, they might shoot the mother, leaving the cubs orphaned like him. Despite everything, despite the danger the mother bear represented, Eli couldn't wish that fate on the cub. Yet warning any people ahead would mean potentially putting himself back in the bear's path, the very danger they'd just escaped. Rusty whined softly, sensing Eli's conflict. The dog pressed against his leg, offering silent support for whatever decision his human made. Eli took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and adjusted his grip on the walking stick. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. "We need to hurry." The emergency flare gun felt surprisingly heavy in Eli's small hand, its bright orange plastic warm from the ranger's grip. He stared at it with a mixture of awe and lingering fear, still not quite believing their ordeal was over. "You're absolutely sure it was a grizzly?" Ranger Mike asked, his weathered face creased with concern as he checked the bandage he'd just applied to Rusty's leg. The antiseptic and proper gauze were a significant upgrade from Eli's makeshift cloth wrappings. "Yes, sir," Eli nodded firmly. "Female with 2 cubs, dark brown with silver-tipped fur. She took over an old cabin about 5 miles northeast of here." The ranger whistled softly. "That'd be the old Chambers place. Been abandoned for decades, but still standing. Makes sense. A bear would claim it." The ranger's station was everything Eli had hoped for. A solid structure with 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, a crackling wood stove radiating blessed heat, and most importantly, a radio connecting them to the outside world. The persistent column of smoke that had guided them here came from the station's chimney, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. Their final approach had been a desperate race. After spotting the bear family moving toward the station, Eli and Rusty had left the relative safety of the stream, cutting cross-country through dense forest in hopes of arriving first. The terrain had been brutal, all uphill, with fallen logs and thick underbrush slowing their already exhausted bodies. They'd emerged into the station's clearing with legs trembling from exertion, only to find the bear family had beaten them there. The mother bear had been investigating the woodpile beside the small cabin, while the cubs explored the perimeter with curious noses. Eli's heart had sunk. If someone was inside, as if confirming his fears, the cabin door had swung open, and a tall figure in a Forest Service uniform had stepped onto the porch, freezing mid-stride at the sight of the bears. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The mother bear had spotted the ranger, rising immediately to her hind legs in a display of protective aggression. The ranger had retreated a step, hand moving to the holster at his hip, and Eli, without conscious thought, had shouted at the top of his lungs while waving his arms wildly, "Hey, over here!" It was perhaps the most foolish thing he had ever done, but it had worked, partially. The mother bear's attention had split between the ranger and this new threat, giving the man time to back inside the cabin door. But now the bear's focus had fixed entirely on Eli and Rusty, who stood exposed at the forest's edge.
For one heart-stopping moment, the bear had seemed ready to charge. Then a deafening bang had split the air, the ranger firing a warning shot into the sky. The sudden noise had startled the bear enough to change her calculation of risks. With a huffing grunt to her cubs, she had led them swiftly away into the forest on the far side of the clearing. Now, safe inside the station, Eli sat wrapped in a wool blanket, a mug of hot chocolate warming his hands. Rusty lay beside him on a folded sleeping bag, his injured leg properly cleaned and dressed, contentedly gnawing on a strip of beef jerky the ranger had provided. "You took an awful risk, son," Ranger Mike said, settling into the chair across from Eli. "Could have gotten yourself killed." "You were about to shoot her," Eli replied quietly. "I couldn't let that happen." The ranger studied him for a long moment. "Maybe, though I'd have tried the warning shot first anyway." He shook his head with grudging respect. "Still, not many grown men would put themselves between a grizzly and her target, let alone a boy your age." Eli sipped his hot chocolate, unsure how to respond. He wasn't sure himself why he'd acted as he had. It had been instinct more than conscious choice, the need to prevent more death, more orphans, whether human or bear. "I've radioed down to the valley station," the ranger continued. "There's a team headed up here first thing tomorrow. They'll get you safely down the mountain." He paused, his expression softening. "I'm real sorry about your parents, son, and the village. We got word about the avalanche, but the storms made rescue operations difficult." Eli nodded, a lump forming in his throat, speaking it aloud to the ranger, explaining who he was and why he was alone in the mountains, had made his loss feel real again, in a way it hadn't during the desperate struggle to survive. "Is it true what you said?" he asked, changing the subject. "About my Uncle Joe making it out?" The ranger nodded. According to my supervisor, there are 17 confirmed survivors from Pinewood Village. Joseph Tanner is among them. They've all been taken to Riverside, the town in the valley. A small flame of hope kindled in Eli's chest. Uncle Joe was alive. He wasn't entirely alone in the world. What about the bears? He asked. Will they be okay? Ranger Mike's eyebrows rose slightly at the question. You're worried about the bears? After what you've been through? Eli shrugged. They were just doing what bears do. It was their den first. The ranger's weathered face creased in a smile. That's a remarkably mature way to look at it. He adjusted the radio on his belt. They'll be fine. That area is part of a wildlife preserve. We'll mark the cabin as an active den site. Warn any hikers to steer clear. The mama bear was just protecting her family, like you said. Outside, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. Somewhere in the surrounding forest, the bear family was finding a new shelter for the night, their path having crossed with Eli's for the last time. Get some rest, the ranger advised, rising to check the wood stove. You've had one heck of a journey. Eli nodded, suddenly aware of how bone-tired he truly was. With a full stomach, warm clothes, and the promise of reunion with his uncle tomorrow, he could finally let his guard down. As he drifted toward sleep, Rusty's solid presence beside him, Eli found himself thinking not of the danger they had escaped, but of something his father had often said: the mountain teaches the most important lessons to those who listen. He wondered what lessons the mountain had taught the mother bear about humans. He hoped they weren't all bad ones. The small wooden bear sat in Eli's palm, its features simple but expressive, carved with the confident strokes of someone who understood both wood and the animal it depicted. A mother bear standing protectively over two small cubs, a family just like the one he'd encountered in the mountains. It's a reminder, Ranger Mike said, as he handed Eli the carving on their final morning at the station. Of what you survived, yes, but also of respect. That bear was just protecting her family, same as you were protecting yours, Eli nodded, carefully tucking the carving into the pocket of his new jacket, one of many supplies the rescue team had brought up the mountain. After 3 days at the ranger station waiting for the weather to clear, they were finally heading down to the valley where Uncle Joe waited. The rescue team had arrived, as promised, bringing medical supplies, fresh clothing, and news from the outside world. The avalanche that had destroyed Pinewood Village was one of several triggered by unusual weather patterns, they explained. Climate change was making the mountains less predictable, the old wisdom less reliable. Ready to go, buddy? Eli asked, crouching to ruffle Rusty's fur. The dog's injured leg was healing well, wrapped in a proper bandage and treated with antibiotics. He would carry the scar from the bear's claw for life, a matching souvenir to the memories Eli would carry in his mind. The journey down from the ranger station was dramatically different from their desperate trek up the mountain. They traveled in a group of 4, Eli, Rusty, Ranger Mike, and a medic named Sarah. They followed established trails, stopping regularly for rest and food. No one had to forge paths through deep snow or sleep under rock overhangs. As they descended, the landscape gradually changed. The deep snow of the upper elevations gave way to patches of exposed ground. The stark pines were joined by other trees, aspens with pale trunks, firs with softer needles. The air grew less biting, more forgiving. Your uncle's been asking about you every day on the radio, Ranger Mike mentioned, as they paused by a small waterfall for lunch. Man was beside himself when he heard you were alive. Sounds like he's already got a room set up for you at his place. Eli nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing through him. Relief at not being entirely alone in the world, gratitude for his uncle's care, but also the ever-present grief that seemed to well up when he least expected it, the knowledge that this new life would never include his parents. Do you think the bear family found a new den? He asked, deliberately changing the subject. The ranger smiled slightly, recognizing the deflection but allowing it. Bears are resilient. She'll have backup denning sites. Probably moved the cubs to one of those by now. In late afternoon, they rounded a bend in the trail, and the valley opened up before them, a patchwork of fields and forests. with a small town nestled against a river that gleamed silver in the sun. Riverside, their destination. Eli paused, taking in the view. It looked nothing like the high mountain village where he'd grown up. More people, more buildings, less wilderness. His future spread out before him. "Your uncle lives on the outskirts," Ranger Mike said, pointing to a cluster of homes near the forest edge. "Still plenty of trees for you and Rusty to explore." The mention of exploration sparked something in Eli's chest. Not quite excitement, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. The mountains had taken much from him, but they had given him something too. Confidence, resilience, the knowledge that he could face tremendous challenges and survive. His father had always said, "The mountain doesn't care if you're tired or scared or lost, so you'd best know how to take care of yourself." Eli had proven he could do that, and more. As they began the final descent into the valley, Rusty limping slightly but keeping pace, Eli found himself thinking not just of what lay behind, but what lay ahead. Uncle Joe had been his father's brother, a forester with similar knowledge of wilderness skills. Perhaps he would teach Eli more, build on the foundation his father had laid. "There's something else you should know," Ranger Mike said as they approached the first outlying buildings of the town. "Your story, surviving alone in the wilderness, the encounter with the bears, it's got people talking." "Park Service is calling you a real mountain child," Eli shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what my dad taught me." "That's the point," the ranger replied. "Those teachings mattered. They kept you alive." He gestured to the mountains behind them, already seeming more distant than Eli expected. "There's a shortage of people who understand the old ways, who can read the land and respect it while surviving in it. When you're older, if you wanted, there might be a place for you with the Forest Service." The suggestion planted a seed in Eli's mind, the first tender shoot of a possible future. Not just survival, but purpose. As they entered the town, Eli spotted a man waiting by the ranger station, pacing anxiously. He was tall like Eli's father, with the same broad shoulders and dark hair, now streaked with gray. "Uncle Joe." The man looked up, spotted their approaching group, and broke into a run. Eli braced himself, Rusty at his side, ready to face whatever came next. Behind them, the mountains stood silent, witness to all they had endured and all that was yet to come. The wooden bear carving rested safely in his pocket, a reminder of both danger and respect, of loss and survival, of endings and new beginnings.